This is a production of Cornell University.
The American dream has captured the imagination of all of us, but what is the price we pay for our individual pursuit of this ideal? Combining personal interviews and longitudinal study covering 40 years of income data, Cornell professor development sociology Tom Hirschl's new book, Chasing the American Dream, which is co-authored with sociologists Mark Rank and Kirk, describes the ups and downs of a riskier and more unequal economy and suggests that personal success and economic well-being are becoming harder to reach. In a Chat in the Stacks book talk presented at Mann Library in November 2014, Hirschl discusses this work to recast our understanding of the American dream in terms that encompass not only wealth, but economic security and the pursuit of one's passions.
So today I just want to go through some things about the book that I like to talk about, and then open it up for questions. And so I have these four. I've organized the talk into these four parts: what we're trying to do, what the methods are, what the research questions, what the methods are, and then sum up what we learned, and then talk about the implications of what we've done. The first thing, though, is that the style of this book is Mark and I have been writing. We have a third co-author who helped us out with the interviews, and he's an assistant professor who's kind of moved on. So it's probably going to be just Mark and I on the next book. But so I'm saying Mark Rank and I, who's a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. The kind of writing we've been doing over the years that we feel is important to do is to try to write for the broadest number of people who are more or less college educated. So that's 30% of the population, something like that. We also try to write for social scientists. And we came across something that Coltrane said one time, where he said, well, he wants to write music for the broadest possible audience, but he doesn't want to piss off the musicians, right? Because jazz musicians are very, very sensitive to some kind of pop riff or something that degrades the musical quality. So that's kind of the spirit that we wrote this in. And so that's how if you want to judge it, that's what we're going for. The book was just published in April, so we've heard from a few of our musicians, a few of the critics in social science. So far, the word is the feedback has been positive, and we've sold a lot of copies in the press. It's been around a lot. So the first part, the mass audience, has gone pretty well. And we've been doing stuff like this for a long time. And we kind of have a preliminary. I mean, we didn't start off to write a book about the American dream. That was kind of brought to our attention by talking to people, by doing focus groups, having in-depth discussions, and studying data. We've been publishing life course papers for many years. So what is this thing? And our initial idea is that, well, it really is. It's kind of an ideology that reflects a middle-class society. I'll do my part, I'll work hard, and I'll expect to be rewarded, right? So that kind of thing. Not the kind of polarized class where you fight for something based on some collective identity. It's really about an individualist worldview. And we find that it's a very moral, it's economics, it's definitely about economic gain. But people feel very strongly that it's not just about getting money, having a nice car. There's some kind of sense of moral validation that we think that that drives people to achieve economic success. And that if you don't achieve economic success, if you fall down, then that's not a good place to be in terms of your moral self-image, and that the condition of poverty is very stigmatized, and being a poor person is not just so much, it's part of it is an economic struggle, but it's a struggle that to be a person, to be a positive person in your own eyes, given the moral dimensions or the moral dynamics of American society. So we felt this very strongly, that this somehow something called the American dream is connected to all this stuff that we've been finding and you can see our papers if you go to something like Google Scholar. You can see our papers over the last 15 years. Okay, the next thing is, what is this? So here are our study questions. First of all, what is this thing that we're talking about? We need to define it, and we worked really hard on that. Secondly, is this thing getting harder to achieve now than in the past? We wanted to answer that question. I mean, this is sort of the second bullet is, a very big point of a lot of social science literature, right? There's increasing inequality. You know, we're becoming a society of haves and have-nots. We wanted to test that. And then we wanted to ask, to what extent is America a middle-class society objectively and subjectively? Objectively in the sense of economic status and life course experience, and subjectively in terms of beliefs and ideology. So what is this thing we're talking about really a middle-class society, or is it something else that we don't understand? And we think it is, based on our preliminary. We think, yeah, this is a middle-class society. So we maybe already have the answer to the third bullet, but we're trying to look at these first two and to really look at it from the point of view of not just snapshot data, but looking at it synthetically across the life course, across many years, to get a full sense of what this is. I gave a lecture this morning for a class, so my voice, I can feel it's a little bit on the edge, so I'll try to keep going with water. So our methodology, we did a lot of focus groups, I think about 15 focus groups. We did 75 in-depth interviews. Kirk Foster helped us, conducted all those interviews. It would last 2 to 3 hours with 20 to 40 pages of transcripts. So a lot of information was recovered. We also looked at, we didn't perform any large-scale nationally representative surveys, but we looked at a lot of them. We looked at all the data we could get our hands on. And we tried to kind of overcome, part of this book is about overcoming academic specialization. We tried to go everywhere we should go based on what the nature of the question we're asking. And then we have this, in terms of how we looked at economic success and hardship, we have longitudinal life course data. We have a little bit of geographically, I see Joe Francis isn't here. I'll mention this to him when I see him, but there's a little bit of GIS in the book too, that it's small, but we feel it's really important, or it's an important point of the book. So it's a lot of social science methods, and we think that social science is pretty, I mean, this should be doable, doing a lot of things in a book like this, a short book. So just to give you a sense of where our data are coming from, this is kind of the backbone of the book. The panel study of income dynamics is a long-standing social science data set that was started during the War on Poverty by President Kennedy. It's 5,000 families, about 18,000 individuals, and it's been running every other year since 2009. They had a federal reduction in funding, but we look at people for 42 years. 2009 was the last wave that was in when we finished the book. And so we have 42 years of data to look at 36 years of the life course between the ages of 25 and 60. And nobody else is doing this as far as we can tell. So the data are there. People tend to take chunks of the PSID and compare the, some time versus another time, but not to use the entire data set. So that's kind of what's unique about, or what's different about our analysis. And we use life tables to sort of summarize the data and identify try to see what the data are telling us, especially to look at something called cumulative risk. So that's kind of the methods. I'm going to try to stop talking about half-past, so I think it's going to work now, I can see. So where does this thing come from? First of all, this concept of the American dream, and it's really clear where it comes from. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with truth and justice for all, this kind of religious-like universal promise that is very distinct from the partial realization of that promise, right? So we have something in the book we call the American paradox, that when Jefferson wrote those words in 1776, only white males voted, he owned over 100 slaves. It was the language was much larger than the objective reality. And of course there's been progress since then, but it's progress that is never really complete and universal in the sense that the statement implies. And we should also, this is a really good book to read, I think. Truslow Adams, he kind of coined this phrase, the American dream, and he talks about not just that this is a great thing, but this is actually a challenge for a country to live up to this thing. And so I think it's actually something worth looking at. So it's really, this is kind of you could say a kind of middle-class idealism, right? That we live in a society where if you work hard and you get ahead, you belong and you will succeed. So based on our analysis of lots of survey data, and this is all secondary analysis, that there's really three parts of the American. First of all, the American dream is not about making $1 million. That's not high on, when you ask people, what is it that you want out of life? That's becoming wealthy is pretty far down. What's always first on the list is this first thing, which is, I want to feel secure. I want to work hard, and in exchange for that hard work, I want security. So that's kind of cool. And we thought that was a good thing to know. It's not about getting rich. The things that maybe economic theory would stress, the rational actor, where you go into a market and you get as much as you can until you reach some marginal probability that you can't go any further without losing. It's really about just this idea of security. A second thing is that people feel very strongly about that they should have the freedom to pursue what they think is important at work. And we think this is related to Amartya Sen's idea that people should be asked what do they value, and then the efficacy, the well-being of the society should be, well, how capable are people of reaching things that they value very highly? So we think that this is also something that we kind of like when we started thinking about it. That, you know, for example, we interview a baseball player who started off with a major league contract, and then he didn't hit. He went straight down, and he's going to work in the summer every day, making like $60 a week below single A level. And his wife is a baseball person. She's basically supporting this guy. And he says, I'm living the dream, right? I'm doing what I want to do. I love baseball. But he's not making any money, right? It's not economically rational. We interviewed a number of people like this as part of our 75. And we also interviewed an actor who feels like, one of the things he said was, if you want to be an actor, don't be an actor. If you need to be an actor, then be an actor. And he's had a life of very low income, right, of being in all these plays that he's very good at. He's a highly regarded actor, but he doesn't make any money. And the fact is, most actors don't make any money. So this idea about pursuing your passion, that's really what the dream is all about. And finally, this concept of people want to feel optimism about themselves, and really I should have the future, that I want to feel optimism about myself and about my family and friends, and that optimism is kind of like a cultural thing that we want. And so these three things we say, or we base, after looking at the survey data, this is what we think it is. So the question is, are people getting it? And the answer is kind of yes and no, and I'll come to that. So part of what we're trying to do is to get a more dynamic image of what's happening to the American people. Not just say they are or they aren't, but what happens over time, and how does experience vary within an individual life. And so the concept of dynamic. So if you look at some of the literature, we're criticizing. This is a graph by Size and Piketty, where they have this data from the Internal Revenue Service, which began collecting taxes in 1913. And they say, well, the top 10% is getting half of the income, right? Then the bottom 90% shares the other half of the income. So really, they're kind of saying there's kind of the elite, the income is all going to the elites. And we're saying, well, maybe, but these are sort of single-year snapshots, and it doesn't say if you're in this is the 1%, and they've been moving up since the 1970s to a position that they were at sort of similarly in the 1930s. And so we have this period of equality, then it's bounded by inequality, and this is their data series. So they're saying, well, what happens? What if someone's in the 1% one year, then they're down, then maybe it's not so unequal. And so there was this article that took our data in Slate magazine and said, well, yeah, what is it about being rich? We don't want to learn more about Slate right now. Who gets to be rich? So this person, percentage of it. So we looked at people over the life course between the ages of, and this is in the book, between the ages of 25 and 60, and we asked, well, who hits these levels of, first of all, of $100,000. So we used kind of six-figure incomes, $100,000, $150, and $250 was the highest one that we looked at. And I like the way that this person took our data and put it in Slate magazine. So if you follow people between the ages of 25 and 60, you see that almost 77% hit 100,000 or more for 1 year. At least 1 year, 150%, just over 50% hit 150,000, and 30% or 32% hit 200,000, and 20%, get this is sort of, and these are 2009 dollars. So this is a pretty big 20%, and this is like a top 2% income if you look at 2009. And if you look for at least 5 years, it goes down to half. This is the sort of a top 20% income, a six-figure income. Half of them hit that, 21% hit 150,000, 10% hit 200,000, and about 5%. If you look at 5 years, only 5%, so it drops very rapidly when you start talking about multiple years. And if you look at it for 10 years or more, it's a third hit 100K. So a lot of people hit 100K, but not that many people get it for a lot of years. And if you look at it consecutively, it would go down to about 20%. The people get 100,000 years, 10 years in a row. 10% get 150,000 or more, 10 years. And this is not consecutive. This is just any 10 years between over this 36-year period. 3% get 200K, and only 2%. So this is sort of a 2% threshold for the income category, and only 2% actually get it for 10 years. So that sort of makes sense, right? 2% get the top 2% income for 10 years. So this is kind of suggesting this observation that, well, actually, we have a lot of fluidity in the income at the top level of the income distribution, which is somewhat different. Now, this is something else there's this Bloomberg Business Insider. I'm not going to go to the page, but does anybody know who Eric Kemme is? He's got a lot of stuff published on the net on business. He's an interesting guy. But one of the questions that people are asking is why the threshold for the 1% has been going up, and why has it been going up? And so we calculated a 1% threshold for every year in the PSID from 1967 to 2010 and published it. And Eric Kemme took our published data, and he showed that actually if you take our 1% threshold, which is this green line, and you can see these are 2009 dollars, it ends up to be about 400. It starts off at about $130,000. It starts off relatively modestly, and this again is 2009 income, and it goes up to over 400,000, and it fluctuates a great deal in the context of the recession. But you see a pretty strong correlation between the S&P 500, which is a thing that people on Wall Street bet on a great deal. So there's some relationship between the threshold for the top 1% and the value of equities. And these are the people that own most of the equities, right? So that kind of makes sense. So I thought that was kind of like an interesting engagement that we got. We put our data out. This guy who writes on Wall Street found it and then put them together and showed this. OK. Now when we look at the other side of the income distribution at poverty risk, this is the chart that the Census Bureau puts out based on a survey that's done every March. They usually publish it always on a Tuesday, an early Tuesday in September. It's sort of like, the Census Bureau's version of Thanksgiving or something, which is always on Thursday. But you can see the official poverty rate. It came down in the 60s as a result of Southern agriculture modernizing. And then it stayed within this narrow band of 10 and 15% ever since. So it's suggesting that, OK, the image you get when you look at this thing is poverty afflicts 10 to 15% of the population. When we look at the data longitudinally, we see, and this is actually wrong. I took it from the wrong. It's just this is just the federal poverty level. It's not 1 point. We have a 1.25 as well, and that's above 50. But if you look at the experience that Americans have with poverty, you see that, and we have this for the total number of years between 25 and 60, and then consecutive years. And so total and consecutive are the same when it's only one, right? Because one is always consecutive within itself. So it's 45% of 47% of the population has 1 year below and that's a fairly low threshold, has one year below poverty. 15% has 5 or more years total, and about 9% have 5 or more consecutive years. So there's a difference between total years and consecutive years. And for people that have 10 or more years of poverty, it's about 7% and only about 4% consecutively. So you can see that poverty is a condition that about half of the population experience during their prime working years, and much smaller fractions experience a lot of poverty if you go 1, 5, and 10. So again, this is saying that poverty is really a problem of the near majority of the population in terms of income poverty. But for people that are a lot of years chronic, people always think poverty is a problem of the chronic poor. It's not. It's a problem of about half the population over the last period of time. And this is what we found when we divide our study into 2 periods, and we chopped it up into 2 21-year periods. And we looked at experience over the life course. What is the change in the odds of someone hitting poverty? We found, well, one of the things we found is that this is a Census Bureau measure of what the Census Bureau calls as deep poverty, which is half the poverty level. The Census Bureau has been putting out studies that this is going up, and that's exactly what we found. Poverty is relatively, basically most people, the majority of people of this age group experience a lot of poverty, and then it goes down greatly for this group normally. But you can see it's been going up, and in particular for deep poverty, went up 22% for people in their 20s and early 30s. 35 to 45, it went up a lot. It was, I forget what it was, but it was like 5 or 6%. It went up to about 8 or 9%. So that's a big percentage jump. It's only a few percentage points, but it's a big percent jump for that age group across these 2 time periods. So this is our evidence that yes, if you look at, although there's a lot of income fluidity, a lot of people are hitting high levels, a lot more people are starting to hit poverty, and in particular this deep level of poverty, which is a relatively difficult event. And it's less true of near, the change is less true for near poverty. And probably the biggest changes are, these are the relatively more secure years of the life course. This is the most secure year of the life course, most secure age span. But this age span has gotten a lot more economic insecurity over this period of time. And I should also mention that people that study inequality talk about how, well, inequality really started to increase around 1970, 71, 72, and has been kind of going up since then. So comparing these 2 periods of early periods of inequality rise to later periods of inequality rise, we see that there's been kind of a linear trend over time. But that's what our interpretation is. Okay. Now this is our GIS that I really like this, and I'm not showing you a lot of race or ethnic data yet. I'm going to show you, the next slide has some on it, but one of the questions that we always get is why is it that there's very sharp race gradients in poverty and in wealth, and poverty and affluence. And for Mark and I, who both teach at universities which are dominant white universities, a lot of the white students think, well, you know, poverty is kind of yesterday's news. We have a black president. It's not really a problem anymore, and why are we talking about this, right? And so we wanted to have something in here that speaks to what we call, we don't use the word social structure that much in the book, but the idea, the social science concept of a structure, something that is relatively fixed over time, or was fixed by history and remains in place, although of course it changes and evolves, it's still there. And so this is an analysis that we did, which takes all the neighborhoods in the country and asks this question: if you grew up in a neighborhood, what is the likelihood that your reference group will be mostly in poverty? And we define mostly as 40% of the kids like you, so white kids, black kids, and Latino kids. And we said that if you're in a neighborhood where 40% or more of the kids are in families below poverty, then you're in a high poverty neighborhood. And then we took this 40%. So if, and this is kind of weird, we took if a third of all the kids in the county were in high poverty neighborhoods, we called that a high poverty county in terms of the kids' reference group. And the way this is coded is that if you can see sort of clear light through here, if it's basically white, that means there's less than 100 kids in the county. And so we sort of exclude it from the study. So for example, there's not very many Hispanic kids in the center of the country. There's not very many black kids in the center here. If it's gray, it means that the kid is living in, or the children of that community are living in a community where it's less than a third of the kids are in high poverty counties. So they're not high poverty counties. So gray means no and black means yes. And if you look at this, the top one, which is white children, you see that most of the county is gray. So most of the kids in the country spatially, except for Albuquerque, Appalachia, and a few places in Texas, and it looks like, I guess that's Nebraska, I think, has a few high poverty areas. South Dakota. Well, that's white. It's not native. Anyway, so most of the white kids are living in counties where there are not where the majority of the kids are in above poverty neighborhoods. It's very different for African Americans. If you look at where we live, kind of the upstate New York, and then all the way down the East Coast, Florida, all across the rural South, California, New Mexico, where you don't see black, you tend to see white, which is there's less than 100 kids, or it's black, and then you have there's some above poverty African American neighborhoods in the Carolinas, Pennsylvania. There's some up and down around the East Coast. But for the most part, if you're black, you tend to come from a county where we have a poor neighborhood, and that has implications for school quality, for health, for crime, because a high poverty neighborhood means that there's not much, the residential capital is not worth much. There's not a lot of wealth in the community. And so it really affects people's life course, how they get their start on life, the kind of resources that the children have in those areas. So in other words, there's a major intersection between, this is not big news on Cornell's campus, but this is what we use to kind of make that point. Intersectionality, right? Social class and race. And then this is how we ran a bunch of life tables to kind of identify race. Non-white in the PSID it's 95% African American, because the sample started in '68 before immigration really got going. So there's a few Latinos in there, but not a lot. So we tracked people and we divided people up into classes based on whether they would hit poverty but not affluence, whether they would hit affluence but not poverty, and whether or not they hit both, or they stayed in the middle throughout their life course, or between the ages of 25 and 60. And this is educational level, whether someone graduated from high school or didn't graduate, or is less than or equal to 12, or greater than, has some college, either not necessarily a full 4-year degree, but has done some education beyond the high school level. And you see that most non-whites, in the terms of about 3/4 of non-whites, that's the biggest penalty. It's a bigger penalty than the education penalty of being a high school graduate or less. Only about 16% of non-whites have a life course where they hit affluence, but they never hit poverty. So that's a big difference. And you see education really matters for this. Education and race really matter. And of course, education is related to social class. It's related to the neighborhood that you grew up in and the ability of your parents or your family resources to get you to a place beyond the high school. So race and education, big factors in stratification across the life course. Again, this is not surprising, but we have maybe more complete data for that. Now, this is Edward Wolff's data. He's probably the top economist for wealth. This is also very important. We have some wealth, and I'm running out of time, but we have some analysis of wealth, something we call asset poverty. Do you have enough assets saved up that you could live for 3 months if you lost your job? And we find that, yes, there's a tremendous amount of asset poverty. It's very, very high. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population really don't have any assets, or they don't have enough assets to get by for a few months. And if you look at the Gini coefficient, it's almost maxed out, right, in terms of financial wealth, which is everything that people own. Financial wealth is everything minus their residential capital, minus their home, whereas net worth includes the home. So you see that the Gini is a little bit lower on net worth because there's some residential capital held by the bottom 60% of society. But if you look at the way that wealth is held, we have very, very intense wealth concentration. It can't really go much higher, in fact, both in terms of total portfolio and especially in terms of financial wealth. So that's, this is not our finding, but that's important for the story. So we have this, I have a couple slides left. The thing we sort of come into with this book, we begin to realize as we get towards the end of the book, is that the American dream is kind of a strange thing. It's kind of this double-edged sword. And Jim Cullen wrote a book about this, so we quote him, that this idealism of the American dream is consistent with failure and inequality as long as there is hope for a better future. Cullen says there's no obvious external barrier forcibly preventing a Latina child from attending an Ivy League university if her test scores are good enough, and so on. This allows us to believe we live in a reasonably fair country that bears some relationship to its founding ideals. In this case, that all men are created equal, quote unquote. As usefully ambiguous as the phrase is, and gives us hope that our dreams are not impossibly out of reach. In an insidious way, this commitment to a fuzzily defined equality of opportunity can actually prevent equality from ever being realized. In much the same way a cigarette smoker believes it is possible to kick the habit and thus remains free to maintain it a while longer. So the idea that if we believe in something, that it can happen, that we won't deal with the fact that it's not happening, right? That's what he's trying to reflect with that. So that's kind of interesting. So we call that the American paradox, right? We believe this is a great place, but it prevents us from really dealing with what's not right with it. So what do we have? Okay, so this is, I want to just kind of sum up a little bit, where I'm already beyond my target here. What we find is a lot of income mobility at the top and the bottom. We're still writing about this. There's more nuances in the data that we haven't totally fleshed out yet, but there's a lot of mobility. And the majority of the population attains middle class income. I should qualify this. One of the people we interviewed was an industrial worker who, when he calculated his overtime, and this was, I don't know, some years ago, he earned 120, his family income, and I think his wife did work, as I recall, but he earned $120,000 one year. He was a high school graduate. He worked really hard in math class. He got a job as an electrician in a big automobile assembly plant. Well, his plant shut down, right? And now he's got a roofing business and he's a photographer. And he feels like he makes $36,000 a year, and he's kind of below. He really can't get much above that ceiling given the opportunities that he sees. And so people hit it doesn't, just because you hit it once doesn't mean you're doing well. So the majority of the people attain this middle class income. A minority attain, a very relatively small minority attain middle class wealth. The majority adhere to middle class ideology. That's what we find. If you look at our numbers from the Pew Memorial Trust and all these different groups that do, we participated in a survey with the Washington Post and the Miller Center. The surveys are really, really clear that this idea of the American dream is, well, it's fading a little bit with some of the younger cohorts, but it's basically still there, I mean, I would argue. And we think that the American dream is becoming harder to attain comparing the past to the present. Given with the time frame of our study from 68 to 2009, it's becoming harder to attain. And there's more nuances. Again, we're still talking about this, but that's the very strong finding. I just accidentally went to the next slide, but that's good because. So to finish this thing off, what I think is going on, and this is the implication, is that many Americans, consciously or unconsciously, are seeking some new social contract, some new way of organizing the society. And this can only be achieved through social and political activity. I have some colleagues from Elmira back there that I'm working with. Hi, guys. We're sort of talking about this as part of our things that we're doing at Cornell. So I want to read from 3 people that we interviewed who they're not representative in some strict, people that do focus groups get really strict about this. We didn't do that. Well, we published some papers. We published several focus group papers, but this is not, we're not saying these are representative, but they're connected to the other people who are concerned. These are just 3 people that are a little bit more developed in their thinking about what needs to happen, and they're built. These are all pseudonyms, right? We didn't say where or who we interviewed. We're maintaining the confidentiality of the people we're interviewing. And by the way, I should say that this is also Exhibit A in my argument that that the first bullet is right. This is the Koch brothers. I found this on the internet. Defending the American Dream Summit in Dallas, Texas, August 29th to 30th, 2014. I think Charles Koch is very smart. He's an MIT engineer. He's not happy with the country. He's not just going to vote Republican. He's fighting for some new way to reorganize the country. And he's thinking and he's putting a lot of money behind. He has a lot of money, right? So he would be one of the people that I think is actually engaging in political and social activity to change the country, right? He sees some problem. I don't agree with him, but this is another kind of thing that is related to what I'm talking about in the first bullet. And my book is falling apart here. That's okay. So here's Bill Green. I think the history of this country and the world show that in any society at any time, there is a struggle between those who want to dominate politically and socially and economically and control everything, and those who want to live their lives in a broader, comfortable way, but they don't feel the need to own vast amounts. They just want enough. And some call that class struggle. And the only thing that has ever won, the larger numbers of people win against a small group that controls the money and the power, has been organization. I think if you look at history, and what I see is that social change has come very rapidly when it has come, and usually to everyone's surprise. People are always trying to organize, and every once in a while something clicks and it happens. Jim Crow was around for 70 or 80 years and it fell apart in months. The Soviet Union was around, I just repeated that. Jim Crow was around for, the Soviet Union was around for 70 or 80 years and it fell apart in months. Jim Crow was around for 100 years. Okay, I may have confused those sentences. And I think there's a very real possibility that things like that can happen. And I don't know when they'll happen or what's going to trigger them and what's going to make it work. But when it happens, it'll surprise you and it'll be fast. Okay, then Elizabeth Rogers, who's an architect and a philanthropist, she's sitting in this art museum. She's a very wealthy person. She's sitting in this art museum that she herself designed when we interviewed her. And she said, well, I guess I would hope that and she's an older person. Well, I guess I would hope that we have the optimism and the willingness and the courage to try new things that I think existed in this country after the war, World War II, she means. We had won this big war and we had confidence. It manifested itself in my narrow world, in architecture and in art. It maintained itself in the GI Bill and more education. We were willing to try new things. I would hope that we would be venturesome again. And obviously it would be about different things. It will be about turning around education. It will be about infrastructure. It will be about new companies. It will be about fixing our healthcare. It will be about seeing our relationship to the world not through the military. And then the final person is LaShawn Jones, who's a homeless teenager. And there's a lot of homeless teenagers in this country, right? If you look at the New York City reports, there's like 50,000 homeless kids in New York City. It's been going up since the last recession. There's a lot of school districts are reporting this. So LaShawn is 19 years old, and we asked him what he thought the American dream was. He said, I feel like the American dream is making things that's impossible possible. People always say it's impossible to do. If you can prove to them that the impossible is possible, that's probably the American dream to me. And then we asked, do you have an example of that? And he said, just like how people said slavery was never going to end, and it eventually ended. But the thought that it was the impossible, but they made the impossible possible. How people thought racism was never going to end, and it probably hasn't ended yet. But it's going to end. It's going to eventually end, and people will be on the same pages. It's just making the impossible possible. So that was LaShawn's take on this thing. And I think that what we see happening is that we're seeing this kind of slow drift towards more and more social polarization. A lot of people are expressing things maybe not as well developed as this in our book, but that's, I think, where the country is at. So I'll leave it there.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.